I'm Wayman Hunt, and I'm with Godfrey's Feed in Madison, Georgia. We are a sixth-generation feed mill that's been serving the Southeast since the 1870s. We manufacture a full line of bagged feeds and minerals, as well as servicing people with bulk feeds. And today we're here to talk about some of the technologies that we use in our feed products. At Godfrey's, we manufacture these are our bag feed products that we manufacture, that we include these Alltech products in. And Alltech is a company out of Kentucky that has helped us take these feeds to a higher nutritional plane. That we're going to have Roger Scaletti here in just a second go into some of these benefits of these products that we have. Bull test, show calf, super calf, all contain the Bioplex High 4, which is a chelated additive that we put in these feeds, as well as all of our winning program feeds. We also offer a full line of minerals, and we start out with a lower quality mineral, the Grazer mineral, and all-purpose. We move up to our free choice, high mag, and free choice with IGR, and finish out with the TRT breeder mineral. Each time you move up one of these levels, the quality of the product gets better. That's why we've got Roger here today to discuss this. And we want to try to help educate our consumers as to what the differences are in these minerals. And a lot of people have heard the word chelates, oxides, sulfates, and those are all different forms of minerals. And cattle in particular, all species actually benefit from having these chelates added to these minerals and their feed formulas. So today we're going to have Roger Scaletti, who began working with Alltech in 2003 after receiving his master's and PhD in ruminant nutrition from the University of Kentucky. With his research background in trace mineral nutrition, today his role with Alltech is in technical sales and support, working with Cellplex and Bioplex trace minerals across North America. Kind of our idea here today is to have Roger maybe fill in some of those holes and explain a little bit in more detail about how these minerals work, what the benefits of them, why they cost a little bit more, and why it's worthwhile doing that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Roger.
Great, thank you, Wayman, and welcome everybody to the meeting, and thank you for listening. I want to talk a little bit today about making sense of a mineral tag. And I know sometimes when you start talking about the numbers on a tag and reading the ingredient list, people just maybe have a little bit of apprehension. Maybe it'd be something similar if you drove up and saw that for your traffic light at the intersection. You just don't know what to do, so maybe you just avoid it altogether. Or you pull up to a sign like that, and you maybe just don't ever go down that road again. So I hope the feed tags, I can share a few things today that I look for and try to point out what they tell you, what it means, and why it's important. And hopefully it's not really as confusing and scary as a lot of people sometimes make it out to be. If we look at our mineral categories, we have two general categories: the major or macro minerals, and we have minor, micro, or trace. All of those would be synonymous. The same minor, micro, and trace all mean the same thing. And this is not very imaginative. The macro or major minerals, the cattle require a higher intake of, and then of course the minor, micro, or trace minerals, they require a lower intake of. So we would typically talk about macro and micro, or more commonly just trace minerals. The macro minerals important in a beef diet are on the slide: calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium, chlorine, and sulfur. Sodium and chlorine are typically more commonly known as just salt, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The trace minerals that are important for a beef diet are iron, manganese, copper, selenium, zinc, iodine, and cobalt. Minerals have a wide role in the body, and without going into an exhaustive list, I just listed some general categories here. Bone development is very important, and that has a big role for calcium and phosphorus. Metabolism and growth, something that's very important for the beef industry. Your animals need to grow. Muscle contraction is another role of several different minerals. One of the big categories is reproduction, and minerals have a big role in reproducing how you can produce that next year's calf crop. Immune function, another big area where we want to supply the cattle with minerals that can achieve optimum immune function to keep our animals healthy. A healthy animal is going to be a more profitable and productive animal. Some other roles of minerals are they prevent oxidative damage in the cells. It's almost like a defense system for cells. And finally, minerals have a role in nerve signaling in the body. If you look at the graph on the slide, you can achieve different abilities in the cattle based on your trace mineral status. If your trace mineral status is low enough, you'll have a clinical sign of a deficiency, and we'll talk a little bit about those. If you have a higher trace mineral intake or status, well, now you're able to achieve optimum growth and fertility. But I think what everybody would like to feed for is optimum immune function. And that's going to require the greatest trace mineral status to get that optimum immune function. There are a lot of ways you can determine a mineral deficiency. One would be looking for clinical signs, and I'll show you in a little bit some of this different deficiency signs or deficiency syndromes that come from a mineral not being adequate. Something else you can do is analyze your forage, pasture, hay, whatever you happen to be feeding, and kind of using the philosophy, if something is not in my forage, it may not end up in the animal. And then finally, you can test blood or tissue samples from the cow to figure out what the actual trace mineral status. This has some limitations, however, whereas liver is typically the best source for figuring out the whole body trace mineral status of cows, but liver is not also the easiest thing to collect from a live animal. Some of the signs of mineral deficiency, so we'd have a clinical deficiency, something you can see when some of these minerals are very low. Milk fever, for example, would be a calcium deficiency. The cow is down and won't get up. Hopefully you don't see too much grass tetany in your cows, but that's a magnesium deficiency. Again, the cows are down and aren't able to get up in many cases. Goiter is an iodine deficiency, and white muscle disease is a selenium deficiency. So a lot of times people might say, well, I don't generally have a problem with the deficiencies, probably because you're supplementing. So the next category to look at are subclinical losses. Maybe we don't have things quite optimized, and perhaps you had a lower calf crop percentage or decreased fertility, maybe a higher pull rate for stressed calves, lower growth rate and lower weaning weights. But the problem with the subclinical losses is that they reduce profitability, but they often go undetected if you don't have good record keeping. So I think this is where we have an opportunity trying to match all of our genetic progress we've made in the beef industry, but has our trace mineral program kept up with some of that genetic progress? When you look at an ingredient list for a mineral or any feed product, you're going to have different categories. And Wayman already talked about a couple of these in his introduction. A concept to introduce first is the whole idea of organic versus inorganic minerals. And in terms of our discussion today, organic means it has a carbon molecule. Inorganic does not have carbon. And that's going to be about it for the chemistry part of the discussion. But it's important not to confuse organic mineral nutrition with maybe organic beef production, where you're not using GMOs or you're not using pesticides or herbicides or antibiotics. That's a whole different meaning of organic. So in terms of trace mineral nutrition, our meaning basically just comes down to, does the mineral contain carbon or does it not? And some examples of inorganic forms you might see on a tag are oxide, sulfate, chloride, and selenite. Organic, another term for organic that Wayman had used earlier, was chelated. It's from the Greek word meaning claw, like a crab's claw, where the mineral is stuck onto something. In the ingredient list, you'd have to use AFCO terms. That's the American Association of Feed Control Officials. So examples are oxide, sulfate, etc. But in terms of the organic trace minerals, you would see names like proteinate or selenium yeast. And two of the products that Alltech produces, Bioplexes are proteinates and Cellplex is a selenium yeast. And just being somebody that looks at a lot of mineral tags, I just had a note on the bottom of the slide. Copper oxide is not available to the cow. So make sure if you're looking at an ingredient list for a product you're using or considering using, that you don't see copper oxide because the cow's not able to do anything with that form of copper. Another way to show you where this difference of organic and inorganic minerals come from, a couple pictures. This is where inorganic minerals come from. They're essentially ground up rock. Many people would actually call them the rock form of trace mineral. It's not necessarily saying they're good or bad, because it's all we had available for a number of years. But now we also know organic minerals exist. And if you think about it, all of the mineral in your pasture, your hay, any grain you may be supplementing is already in an organic form, because that's how the plants store trace minerals. So however many millions of years cattle have walked on the earth, they've been consuming minerals, both the major or macro minerals and trace minerals, in an organic form. So if that's how they evolved to consume minerals, maybe that's the way we should supplement minerals as well. The National Research Council, or NRC, puts out recommendations for the nutrient requirements of beef cattle every so many years. The most recent issue was in 2016, but I guess I would ask the question, are we feeding the same animal as 2016, or have we even continued our genetic progress? The NRC really didn't discuss the form of mineral, the whole debate of organic versus inorganic. And many feed companies' typical approach was basically taking the NRC requirement and just doubling it using inorganic sources of minerals because they were cheap. And that may have led to over supplementing and not actually achieving the end goal of achieving optimum status in the cattle. So the question we're really trying to answer is, are we leaving performance on the table? And do we have some opportunities in our trace mineral program for improving the trace mineral nutrition and maybe capturing some of that genetic potential? Many of you have probably seen this mineral interaction wheel, and it's important to remember that what you do with one trace mineral can impact other trace minerals. There's also things that like antagonists, minerals that just kind of interfere with other things. Sulfur, for example, can come from both forage or water. And when we look over here on the mineral wheel, sulfur can impact with copper, or it can also impact selenium absorption. Iron is another one. Iron could be in forage or water, and iron will impact copper absorption. Molybdenum might also be in pasture or forage, and molybdenum can impact copper. What really is the worst for copper is if you have higher sulfur with elevated molybdenum, they kind of tag team and really reduce the availability of copper. So kind of trying to avoid some of these antagonist interactions, you can better achieve that if you're using an organic bioplex, cellplex form of mineral because they resist some of those chemical interactions in the body. So to look at a few tags specifically, this is an example of a Godfrey's tag. And if you look at just zooming in on it, it tells you, kind of its purpose and what it's for, free choice mineral for beef cattle on pasture. If you read the feeding directions, it tells you how to use the product. This particular mineral is a 4-ounce product. So it's important to keep in mind, obviously cattle can't read. They don't know they're supposed to eat 4 ounces. So this is more of an average over a period of time, whether it's several days or a week. But hopefully you would achieve about a 4-ounce intake of this product. And then they'd have a warning statement. And the typical warning statement you'd see on a cattle mineral is to avoid feeding this product to sheep because it contains copper. Sheep are very sensitive to copper compared to other ruminants like cattle or goats. It's probably a combination that they absorb copper more effectively as well as don't excrete copper as well. So they can just have a much lower requirement for copper. So that's why you wouldn't want to use a beef mineral on sheep. So if we dig in a little further and look at the guaranteed analysis, you can see all the minerals listed, most of the macro minerals on the left and the micro or trace minerals on the right. And it does get a little confusing in that we have 3 different units represented on the tag. We have some minerals represented as a percentage, some minerals as parts per million, or the vitamins in this case are represented as international units per pound. So just to walk through how you kind of can make sense of this a little bit, Remember, this product is a 4-ounce mineral, which would be 0.25 pounds. So the percent numbers are very simple. It's just your intake times your percentage converted to a decimal will give us an intake of 0.6 ounces of calcium in this 4-ounce product. If we look at salt, we would generally have about a 1-ounce intake of salt based on these percentages with our 4-ounce product. Just a few comments about salt. Salt is the only mineral that cattle can consume to meet their needs. Cattle do not have nutritional wisdom. Your cows in the pasture at home aren't waking up one day saying, I'm a little bit selenium deficient. I better go consume some mineral. The only reason they go to a salt mineral or a salt-based mineral is to consume the salt. So everything else is just kind of along for the ride, if you will. And then if we look at vitamin A, then the units is international units per pound. So we just have to multiply our intake by our concentration to give us 75,000 IUs of vitamin A per cow per day. A lot of times, many people would formulate the mineral to have about a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium and phosphorus. And then based on intake, some of these other numbers, may move around a little bit, but 2-to-1 ratio of calcium and phosphorus is very common for a free choice mineral. So now to kind of dive in a little bit on the trace mineral side of things. So this parts per million is also known as milligrams per kilogram, but that's a metric unit. So we have an intake in pounds and a metric unit. So you got to do one of two things. You got to either convert your intake in pounds over to maybe kilograms, or convert your concentration from milligram per kilogram to milligram per pound. And that's what I did in this example. So I do a lot of formulation, so I used 4 decimals. You don't need to do that. You could just do 2.2 for a shortcut. But if you divide, in this case, zinc is 3,750 parts per million. That's also known as 3,750 milligrams per kilogram. Divide that by 2.2, we'll get a number that's 1,700 milligrams per pound. And then it's just like our vitamin numbers from the previous slide. Once we have our units right, milligrams per pound, multiply that by our quarter-pound intake, and here we go. We're going to supplement 425 milligrams of zinc per cow per day. So the next thing I'll do on a tag is look at the ingredients, and you just look for different names. Zinc sulfate, copper sulfate, selenium yeast, sodium selenite. All of these can fall into 2 categories, as we previously discussed: an inorganic source, oxide, sulfate, carbonate, chloride, or selenite, or an organic source, such as selenium yeast. And just a note that if you see the same mineral listed with multiple sources, there's no way to know from the tag what ratio they are supplied. So in this case, we have selenium yeast and sodium selenite. From the tag itself, you can't tell, is it a 50-50 blend? Is it 25%, 75%? There's no way to tell from the list of ingredients. So in this case, you'd have to ask the company, you ask Wayman, maybe their marketing material would reflect how much of that mineral, say, is organic selenium and how much is inorganic. To look at another tag, the breeder TRT mineral, again, just tells you the name of the product. TRT stands for Total Replacement Technology. And as you'll see on the ingredient list, all of the trace minerals are offered in an organic form. So using the form that cattle can do the most with. You'll see a note sometimes on some different mineral products about the intake of selenium and not to exceed 3 milligrams per head per day, because that's the FDA or Food and Drug Administration's regulation. You're not legally allowed to supplement more than 3 milligrams per head per day to a beef cow. And that's why companies like Godfrey's would have a note about this legal requirement when it comes to selenium. So again, just very similar tag as the last one. We have some percentages for the macro minerals, parts per million for the trace, some of the trace minerals. And over here, they list the IUs per pound for the vitamins. So a very similar calculation. You can do the 2,500 ppm, convert it to milligrams per pound for zinc, and then multiply by your intake to give you the actual quantity of consumption. Looking at the feed tag, you see a lot less sources of trace minerals in this product. Basically, you see proteinates and selenium yeast. So all of these proteinates and selenium yeast are organic or chelated sources, and Godfrey's is using Bioplex and Cellplex as the source. I would say that this product does not have any inorganic trace mineral sources. Iron oxide is not a source of iron to the cow, it's included for red color. So even though you'd see the name oxide up there for iron, I wouldn't really consider it a source of iron. It's not an available source of iron. It's there as a coloring. So I would say this product has all of its trace minerals in an organic or chelated form. So if you look at the tags next to each other, and this you can do if the intake of the product is the same. Both of these minerals are 4-ounce intake products. So if we already did our calculations for zinc, you can see the zinc on the tag and how many milligrams it supplies, all inorganic from sulfate for the product on the left. For the TRT product, we're supplementing a little bit less, but it's all organic or all bioplex zinc. So it's important not just to look at the numbers on a tag, to look further into that ingredient list to see what went into making that that product or where that mineral is coming from. And sometimes if you're comparing maybe from other companies, the feeding rate may not be the same. So for example, I mentioned the legal limit of selenium is 3 milligrams per cow per day. If a mineral product only has a 2-ounce intake, then that product would have 52 parts per million selenium. So if you were just looking at tags without factoring in the intake differences, you would say, hey, maybe I need this 52 ppm selenium product. But since it only has a 2-ounce intake compared to a 4-ounce intake with a 26 ppm product, well, our selenium intake is going to be the same. So I know there's a lot of math involved, or could be. If the products have the same intakes, then you can easily just compare the numbers side by side. But a number is only half the story. Did they use proteinates to achieve that, or selenium yeast to achieve that mineral concentration? Or did they use sulfates and oxides? And there might be some differences there in expected performance of the cattle. Some additional considerations: don't provide additional salt sources unless suggested on the mineral tag. Again, the salt is what's driving the cattle to consume the product. So in most cases, you shouldn't have a separate source of salt. And this was mentioned on that first tag I showed. If mineral intake is excessive, move your mineral feeder further away from the watering source. Sometimes people have said, Roger, it's at the farther end of the pasture. I can't get it any further away. Well, maybe then sometimes you would have to add some salt to try to get that intake closer to the recommended, in this case, 4 ounces. If mineral intake is inadequate, then just do the opposite. Move the mineral feeder closer to the watering source. And again, sometimes people said, Roger, they're right next to each other and I'm still not getting the intake I want. And then maybe you could add a protein meal or something to increase the palatability or improve the taste of that mineral. But no matter what, I think it's very important to track mineral intake. And this could be as simple as, number of bags per week divided by number of cows divided by 7 days, or however frequency you're using or feeding mineral. Keep in mind a 50-pound bag of mineral with a 4-ounce intake would have 200 feeds in it. So you can feed a 200 cow herd for 1 day, a 100 cow herd for 2 days, or if you had one lone cow, you could feed her for 200 days. So just keep in mind what 4-ounce should supply, or a 50-pound bag should cover so many cows, 200 cows for 1 day, and are you achieving that intake of the tag? And monitoring that to know if you're having consumption is going to go a long way to having a good, successful trace mineral program. So with that, thank you for your attention. And Wayman, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to do my best to answer them.
You bet. I do have a couple of questions for you, Roger. I appreciate you doing that. And one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about too is I think you brought up a couple of really good points there, the 200 feedings per bag. And I hear a lot of people complain, oh, I put a bag of minerals out and it's gone, and they think that a bag of minerals should last a lifetime. And when you start talking about putting it in that perspective, I think that's a great point. And I just wanted to drive that point home with our audience that if you got 50 cows, or let's say the average herd in this part of the country is only in the 30-35 range, you're talking about a week's worth of minerals, so they should be going, 35, a breeding group should be going through a bag of minerals a week
Sure.
all year long. So I think that's a great point, and I really enjoyed listening. You are carrying forward or carrying through with some of the things that Montana and I have been working on, in that all feed tags are not created equal,
Right.
and so those were some really good points. You can't always just compare tags, not only from a formulation standpoint, but from a pure number standpoint. So those were great points. I really enjoyed listening to that. You talked about these organic minerals being more bioavailable. Maybe if you could go into that just a little bit more and maybe explain maybe how they are, or what you mean by that.
Sure. So bioavailability would mean how much of, in this say case, a mineral is digested, absorbed, and utilized in the target tissue. So there are differences in how you can achieve that, or how the minerals are digested, absorbed, and transported to a target tissue based on the form you choose to supplement. Generally speaking, the chelates are higher bioavailability compared to the sulfates, which are higher availability than the oxides. So basically, it's just a measure of how much of the mineral actually is retained by the cow and isn't just passed out in the manure and wasn't of any use to the cow.
That's excuse me, that brings up another point in going back to your feed tags and what they're saying. In our good, better, best scenario, what you'll see a lot of times as well is those good minerals may be full of oxides, and you even specifically mentioned copper oxide, which is not useful in cattle at all. But those copper oxides, and then you move over into your sulfates, and then you move over into your chelates, and when you start doing that, you will see some of those numbers changing. I think you guys have got a good bit of research that shows that you can get away with feeding even less than NRC guidelines to these animals with these chelates. And so you'll notice that on a lot of our feed tags, we may not have the highest numbers on our feed tags, but what we've done is we've used the highest quality ingredients to
Right.
get to a happy medium that is going to get the performance that you want, while controlling cost, and really maximizing your performance. So those are great points. Here in the Southeast, what do you see as the most deficient mineral that we're dealing with?
I'd say, Wayman, typically selenium is going to be the most deficient mineral, generally speaking, and that's probably the mineral for the most part where people would move to an organic source. And as you mentioned, trying to keep costs down, and maybe like yourselves in your better mineral, you have selenium yeast or Celplex with sodium selenite, and some of the other trace minerals still have the inorganic sources. So I would argue that your better mineral is trying to improve selenium intake and selenium absorption first, and probably rightfully so for the Southeast US.
What in particular, why is it important for these guys to feed selenium?
Oh, selenium's important for many different things: immune function, um, health, general health, some work with fat tissue and how the calf keeps warm when it's born. It's just a trace mineral that has a lot of uses in the body, but generally the problem is it's just not in our soils in the Southeast, so it doesn't end up in the plants. So if you don't supplement, your cows aren't going to get it. So I think just selenium is probably one of the more important minerals for cattle in the Southeast.
That kind of brings me to another point in antagonisms with these minerals. Um, you talked about it earlier in the conversation. Maybe what kind of antagonistics do you see in this part of the country, in the Southeast? And I think that kind of probably plays into your selenium, and the question I just asked about the selenium, and how does all that relate?
Typically, I'd say, Wayman, the pretty much the antagonist I listed on the slide: sulfur, iron, and molybdenum. are generally the ones that you'd see the highest. Sulfur and iron can both come from feed or water. I'd say a lot of times water would be the unknown portion of many diets or many cows' daily consumptions. Water is a little bit of an unknown. It's not commonly tested. But if your water was high in sulfur, that could antagonize or decrease the absorption of selenium and copper. And that would further kind of warrant using a source of selenium that is more available to the cow, something like selenium yeast or Cellplex, to deal with some of those antagonisms. And I'd say the same thing for both iron and molybdenum as well, with some of the antagonisms they have with copper. The old theory was I could just put in so much copper of oxide or sulfate and the cow will get by. Well, you can't really overcome an antagonism just by adding more and more and more. Their best bet is to switch your form and move from that inorganic form to the organic, because it's less available for interactions in the rumen. That's where a lot of these antagonists happen, or these antagonist interactions. And basically what would happen, Wayman, is say, sulfur would bind with copper. And then once that whole complex ends up in the small intestine where absorption takes place, the body says, hey, I don't even recognize what this stuff is. So I'm just going to let it pass out in manure. So it's really just an issue that these antagonists ultimately prevent absorption from some of these trace minerals that we know are important for our cattle.
That's exactly what we needed to hear. I think one of the points too that I might try to drive home to some of these people as well is that now we're seeing a lot of our customers, and if you're buying our feeds, our mixed feeds, the bags of feed that we were flashed up on the screen earlier, you don't really need to worry quite as much about it. Now, I would always say that you need to have a good free choice mineral available all the time, whether you're feeding feed or you're not feeding feed. Um, I feel that's really important. The other thing that I would say is that when in today's world, so many of our customers are moving towards supplementing with commodities. Everybody's
Right.
always worried about prices and trying to get these cattle fed as inexpensively as possible. And to your point about the antagonisms, I think that it even gets to be more and more important to use a really good mineral when we're single ingredient supplementing these cattle. You know, DDG, I think
Right.
in particular is can be high in sulfur or corn gluten, and so you see a lot of that stuff. And so I think that that's even more of a reason to use these higher end minerals and high quality minerals, because you start getting that cow out of whack and a lot of bad things can happen.
Sure. And then you mentioned distillers, Wayman. Depending how the ethanol plant controls pH in their fermentation, if they're using sulfuric acid, they can have a distillers that has a lot of extra sulfur. Didn't affect the plant, but it affects the people using that distillers in their cattle. Some ethanol plants would use phosphorus or phosphoric acid, and then you could have a high phosphorus distillers. Again, it doesn't affect the use in the plant, the production plant, but when people are feeding it to cattle, it becomes a almost okay. Distillers is high in protein, high in fat. What else might be coming in that I really don't know about? And you're exactly right. I think with the need or importance of a good mineral program that complements some of those byproducts or co-products, because they're not a designed product. It's what's left over when somebody else did their fermentation, and then they say, well, what can we do with this? Well, we can feed it to cattle. So I think you're completely right with that.
And to your point, I'd like to say that those guys, I don't want to say they don't care, but their job is to make ethanol or
Right.
sugar or whatever, and they're not as concerned about the product that comes out of there. And so when you're using those feed types, those feed stuffs, you really need to keep that in mind, that the guy that's making it really isn't that concerned about how well that cow performs on those products. and
Definitely.
and and, and then those minerals really do become a vital part of that. And you know, I always tell this to everybody, what's one more calf worth?
Exactly.
Even in today's world where the cattle prices aren't the best right now, it's probably even more important, because that one calf that may be worth $750 may pay for the minerals for your whole herd.
Definitely.
depending on what it is you're dealing with. So I think those are all great points. Do you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think we covered it, Wayman. I would just encourage the folks listening, just have a look at the mineral tag of the products you're using, and just realize not all minerals are created equal, or mineral products, and just there's the numbers and the ingredient list, and just don't look at the numbers without focusing on the ingredient list. And I think they might have some eye-opening experiences with maybe why something is as cheap as it is, and there's opportunities for improvement, I think, in many different trace mineral programs. But I think that'd be my summary, Wayman.
Well, thank you for your time and your expertise and sharing your knowledge. I really enjoyed that. I picked up a few pointers there as well, and always enjoy doing that. I would say, to further your point, yeah, we do need to. Um, there's a lot of times where you can hold a nickel so close to your eye you can't see that dollar behind it.
Sure.
And I think that everything that we try to do at Godfrey's is high quality at the most reasonable price that we can do it. And so I would encourage everybody to, if they have more questions or anything, feel free to contact us. Feel free to contact you, Montana here. And you can get to any of our contact information through our website at www.godfreysfeed.com. With that, I'd say thank you, Roger, and hope you have a great day.
Great. Thank you. I enjoyed it, Wayman. Thank you very much.
Thank you.